What happens when one of late-night television's most skilled interrogators, Stephen Colbert, known for his razor-sharp wit and relentless questioning, tries to corner a Kennedy only to find himself completely caught off guard by an unexpected response? What started as typical political comedy banter quickly turned into an uncomfortable moment when Kennedy spoke about his uncle's funeral in a way that left Colbert stunned. You're about to witness one of the most shocking and uncomfortable moments in late-night television history. Stephen Colbert, known for his razor-sharp political wit and relentless interrogation style, was about to learn what happens when you attack the wrong family legacy on national television. The Late Show host, who has built his reputation on cornering politicians with clever comedy and pointed questions, was about to face something that would leave him completely speechless and his studio audience in stunned silence. For years, Stephen Colbert has been late-night television's most skilled political interrogator. He's dismantled politicians with surgical precision, exposed hypocrisy through brilliant satirical commentary, and always managed to maintain the upper hand no matter how powerful his guests. But on this particular evening at his New York studio, Colbert would encounter a guest who would show him the difference between political comedy and personal cruelty, between wit and genuine pain. Senator John Kennedy had agreed to appear on the show, expecting the usual political sparring. Some pointed questions about his voting record, maybe some clever jokes about his conservative positions, nothing he hadn't navigated before. What he didn't expect was for Colbert to launch a sustained attack on his family's memory, questioning whether his assassinated uncles would approve of his political positions. What you're about to see isn't just another late-night political segment gone wrong. This is what happens when satirical comedy crosses into sacred territory, when someone mistakes family tragedy for comedy material, and when a talk show host discovers that some wounds never heal and should never be mocked. The Late Show studio was about to become the setting for a moment that would be remembered as the night a comedian learned that there are lines you simply don't cross, especially when it comes to family members who died serving their country. The cool New York evening air carried a sense of anticipation as Senator John Kennedy arrived at the Late Show studios with his characteristic quiet dignity and cautious professionalism. The veteran politician moved through the backstage corridors with the measured awareness of someone who understood he was walking into one of television's most challenging political arenas, his sharp eyes taking in the bustling energy of a major network production. "Good evening," he said respectfully to the crew members he encountered, his distinctive Louisiana accent carrying a warmth that seemed almost out of place in the fast-paced New York environment. There was something both humble and alert about his demeanor, like a seasoned diplomat preparing for delicate negotiations. His publicist walked closely beside him, her tension barely concealed as she reviewed her strategy notes one final time. "Senator, remember that Colbert's different from the other hosts. He's going to come at you from unexpected angles, probably try to pin you down on specific votes or positions. Just stay focused on your talking points, and don't let him bait you into anything personal." Kennedy nodded with that familiar intelligence, his weathered face showing the kind of wisdom that comes from surviving decades in the political arena. "I've been handling hostile interviews since before Stephen Colbert was making jokes about politicians," he replied with measured confidence. "A little political theater never scared me." The makeup artist worked efficiently, clearly impressed by his natural politeness and old-school courtesy. "Senator Kennedy, I have to say, you handle all this media attention with such grace. Some politicians come in here looking like they're heading to an execution." "Well, I suppose that depends on who's asking the questions," he replied with a slight smile. The studio erupted in enthusiastic applause as Kennedy made his entrance, his commanding yet humble presence immediately filling the space. Colbert greeted him with his trademark grin and seemingly genuine warmth. But there was something calculating behind his eyes that suggested this wasn't going to be a standard political interview. Everything felt like the setup for typical Late Show political comedy, but Colbert's expression suggested Kennedy was about to face something far more personal than policy questions. "So, Senator Kennedy," Colbert began with his trademark blend of charm and calculated precision, leaning back in a chair with the relaxed confidence of a man preparing to execute a well-planned strategy. I have to ask you about something that's been fascinating me. You're a Kennedy, obviously, from one of America's most famous liberal political families, and yet here you are in Louisiana voting like you've never heard of the New Deal. How does that work exactly? The audience chuckled appreciatively, clearly expecting this to be the start of another classic Colbert political takedown. Kennedy's weathered face remained composed as he processed the question, though there was a subtle shift in his posture that suggested he recognized this wasn't going to be a straightforward policy discussion. Well, Stephen, I think you might be confusing family name with personal conviction, Kennedy replied, with his characteristic measured tone. I vote the way I believe is right for Louisiana and for the country, not based on what some people think a Kennedy should believe. Colbert leaned forward with that predatory smile that his regular viewers knew meant he was setting up for something bigger. But come on, Senator. Your family basically wrote the playbook for progressive politics in America. JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Ted Kennedy. These were champions of civil rights, social programs, liberal causes. And then there's you, voting against climate change legislation and supporting conservative judges. It's like finding out that one of the Von Trapp children grew up to be a Nazi sympathizer. The studio audience erupted in laughter at the comparison, but Kennedy's eyes narrowed slightly, not with anger, but with the recognition that this line of questioning had a very specific and personal destination in mind. I think you're oversimplifying both my family's legacy and my own positions, Kennedy said carefully, his voice still calm, but carrying a new edge. My family believed in serving the country with honor. That's exactly what I'm doing. Colbert's grin widened, clearly enjoying the setup he was creating. Right, but don't you think they'd be a little confused by some of your votes? I mean, if JFK could see you opposing healthcare expansion, wouldn't he wonder what happened to the family values? The question hung in the air like a trap, and Kennedy realized this wasn't going to be about policy at all. Colbert's satirical instincts kicked into overdrive as he sensed he had Kennedy exactly where he wanted him. His voice took on that familiar late-show rhythm, the one that signaled to the audience that the real political dismantling was about to begin. I mean, let's really dig into this, Senator, Colbert continued, his tone becoming more pointed while maintaining his signature comedic delivery. You've voted against expanding healthcare access, you've opposed climate change initiatives, you've supported rolling back environmental protections. Are we supposed to believe that the same family that gave us the Peace Corps and the Civil Rights Act would be cheering you on from the sidelines? The audience was fully engaged now, laughing at what they perceived as Colbert's brilliant political satire. Kennedy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his legendary self-control being tested in a way that was clearly unprecedented for what was supposed to be entertainment television. Stephen, I think you're confusing principles with politics, Kennedy replied, his voice carrying the first hint of real irritation. My family taught me to think for myself and do what's right, not to follow some predetermined script because of our last name. But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed energized by Kennedy's defensive response, leaning into what was clearly becoming more of a political prosecution than comedy. But here's what's really interesting. Colbert pressed, his voice dropping the pretense of casual conversation. Your voting record reads like a conservative wish list. You've opposed gun control measures, voted against women's reproductive rights, supported tax cuts for the wealthy. I'm starting to think maybe you got switched at birth with some other Kennedy baby, because this doesn't exactly scream Camelot, you know? The studio audience laughed loudly, but there was an uncomfortable edge to it now. Kennedy's hands gripped his chair slightly tighter as he realized this wasn't political comedy anymore. It was a calculated assault on his right to carry his own family name. Colbert's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of a satirist who thought he had found the perfect political target. The pretense of respectful political comedy had been completely abandoned, and everyone in the studio could sense that something far more personal and calculated was about to unfold. You know what, Senator, Colbert said, his voice taking on a tone that made several audience members shift uncomfortably in their seats. I've been thinking about this whole Kennedy legacy thing, and I have to ask, What do you think your uncles would say if they could see your voting record today? I mean, JFK championed civil rights, and you're voting with people who want to roll back voting protections. Bobby fought for the poor, and you're supporting policies that benefit the wealthy. The question hit the studio like a physical blow. The audience's laughter became noticeably more nervous, and even some of Colbert's staff exchanged uncomfortable glances. This was the kind of personal attack that crossed every professional boundary, weaponizing Kennedy's murdered family members against him in the most public way possible. Kennedy's entire demeanor changed in an instant. The measured composure shifted to something much more intense and protective. His voice, when he spoke, carried a tremor of genuine pain mixed with growing anger. The voice of someone whose most sacred memories were being used as comedy material. "Stephen, you're talking about dead men now," Kennedy said, his voice steady but filled with barely contained emotion. "You're talking about my uncles who were murdered serving this country. I don't think their memory is appropriate material for your television show." But Colbert had clearly decided that respect for Kennedy family tragedy was irrelevant to good political television. He leaned forward even more aggressively, his voice taking on what seemed like manufactured concern mixed with obvious mockery. "I'm just saying, doesn't it bother you that if JFK and Bobby could see you now, they might wonder what happened to the Kennedy they thought they knew? Like maybe you're the Kennedy who forgot what the family actually stood for." The studio audience sat in stunned silence, finally realizing they were witnessing something that had gone far beyond political comedy into deeply sacred territory. What happened next would become one of the most explosive confrontations in late-night television history. Colbert's attack on Kennedy's murdered uncles and their memory had pushed the veteran senator past every boundary of professional courtesy, and the quiet intensity that had served him well in politics was about to transform into something far more fierce and protective. "You want to talk about what my family stood for, Stephen?" Kennedy fired back, his voice rising with an intensity that made everyone in the studio freeze. "Let's talk about men who gave their lives for this country while you sit behind a desk, making jokes about their sacrifice. Let's talk about what it means to honor the dead instead of using them as punchlines." Colbert's face showed a flicker of uncertainty as he realized his comedy routine had awakened something far more dangerous than he had anticipated. "Senator, I'm just pointing out the political contradictions between your positions and your families." "Political contradictions?" Kennedy cut him off, his presence filling the studio with an authority that was both magnetic and intimidating. "You think my dead uncles are political talking points? You think their assassination is material for your satirical commentary?" The other show staff were completely paralyzed, afraid to intervene in what had become an all-out confrontation between a television host and political royalty. The studio audience watched in shocked silence as the exchange escalated beyond anything they had ever witnessed on a comedy show. "Your uncles must be rolling in their graves." Colbert shot back desperately, tried to regain control through humor that now sounded petty and cruel. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of what would become the most uncomfortable and personally devastating exchange in late-night television history. Kennedy's response was building to something that would leave Colbert completely speechless. The silence that followed Colbert's cruel comment about Kennedy's uncles rolling in their graves felt like it stretched on forever. Kennedy stood there, his chest rising and falling with controlled breaths, his most sacred family memories hanging in the balance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that unmistakable Kennedy authority mixed with something deeper, the raw pain of a nephew who had buried heroes. "Stephen, you just crossed a line that you can never uncross," Kennedy said, his words cutting through the studio like broken glass. "You want to know what my uncles would think? Let me tell you about the last time I saw my Uncle Bobby alive." Colbert realized he had pushed too far, but it was too late to take back what had been said. The studio fell completely silent as Kennedy's voice took on the weight of profound grief. "I was 14 years old, standing in my Uncle Bobby's funeral, watching my cousins who had just lost their father, watching my family try to hold together after losing two brothers to assassination. And do you know what I learned that day, Stephen?" The words landed like thunder in the studio. Colbert opened his mouth to respond, but found himself completely speechless, his usual quick wit abandoned in the face of such profound family tragedy. Kennedy continued, his voice steady but filled with the power of lived grief. I learned that when someone dies serving their country, their memory becomes sacred, not political, sacred. And when you mock that sacrifice, you're not being clever. You're showing everyone how empty you are inside. Colbert sat frozen, completely outmatched by the depth and dignity of Kennedy's pain. The comedian who had built his career on having the last word found himself with absolutely nothing to say. My uncles died believing in America, Stephen. They didn't die so you could use their graves as comedy material. With that devastating final blow, Kennedy had turned Colbert's own attack into a lesson about respect for the dead that left the host completely defeated. The silence that engulfed the Late Show studio after Kennedy's devastating response was unlike anything the crew had ever experienced. It was the kind of profound, uncomfortable quiet that follows a moral catastrophe, when everyone present realizes they've just witnessed someone's family tragedy being exploited for television entertainment. The only sound were the mechanical hum of cameras still rolling and the horrified whispers of audience members who couldn't believe what had just been done to a grieving family member. Colbert sat frozen in his chair, his face cycling through expressions of shock, regret, and something that might have been the dawning realization of how badly he had miscalculated. When he finally tried to speak, his voice lacked its usual confidence, replaced by something that sounded almost desperate. "Senator, I think maybe we should take a break here," he stammered, attempting to regain some control of his own show. "I didn't mean to, but the damage was already done and everyone knew it." The studio audience sat in stunned disbelief, many shaking their heads in obvious disgust at what they had witnessed. Several audience members could be heard whispering, "That was wrong," and "You don't mock the dead," their voices carrying clearly in the unnaturally quiet studio. The production crew stood motionless, knowing they had just captured something that would be remembered as one of the most inappropriate moments in television history. This wasn't just a comedy segment gone wrong. This was the moment when a satirist learned the hard way that some family pain is too sacred to touch. What you just witnessed wasn't political comedy or satirical commentary. It was a masterclass in dignity defeating cruelty. And Kennedy's profound grief had turned Colbert's own show into a lesson about respecting the dead that would be remembered long after the cameras stopped rolling. And that's how late-night television's most skilled interrogator went from confident host to speechless bystander in less than 20 minutes. All because Stephen Colbert decided that mocking John Kennedy's assassinated uncles was more important than showing basic respect for family tragedy. Kennedy's story about his uncle's funeral didn't just shut down Colbert's attack. It exposed the heartless cruelty behind his political comedy. The question is, do you think Colbert learned his lesson about attacking sacred family memories? Or will he continue using tragedy as comedy material? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe for more moments that show what happens when comedians cross lines that should never be crossed. Until next time, remember, some pain is too sacred for punchlines.